One man refused to bow. Sometime before 600 CE, in a city built entirely around idol worship, a merchant named Zayd ibn Amr walked out of a religious festival and never worshipped a stone again. It cost him almost everything. His own uncle turned against him for it. He spent the rest of his life searching for the true religion of Abraham, a faith that didn't have a name yet, and died 5 years before the man who would finally complete that search was even called a prophet. Who would finally complete that search was even called a prophet. Was Zayd part of something real? A hidden thread of pure monotheism running quietly beneath centuries of idol worship? Or is he a legend built backward, a man later generations needed to have existed? To answer that, we have to go back to the city that made him and the world sitting around it. Islamic tradition remembers the age before Muhammad as Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance. A land of idols, waiting on a sing revelation to break the spell. Zayd and a small handful of men are remembered for having broken it early. On their own, decades before Muhammad spoke a word of scripture. Here is the question this film keeps circling back to. Is that story true? Or is it the kind of story a new religion tells about the past, once it needs the past to look like it was already waiting? The men in question left almost no writing of their own. What survives comes through Quranic references, through biographies written 200 years after they died, and, more recently, through new archaeological research into the desert itself. Each source tells a different part of the story, and none of them fully agrees with the others. By the end, that disagreement turns out to be the real story. By the 6th century, Arabia sat squeezed between two exhausted superpowers. Christian Byzantium to the north and west, Zoroastrian Persia to the northeast. Locked in an on-and-off war for 300 years. Both empires armed Arab client kingdoms to fight it for them. The Ghassanids for Rome, the Lakhmids for Persia. Two frontier buffers already living inside the religions of the book, generations before Islam. Further south, entire Jewish tribes had put down roots at Yathrib, the oasis town that would later become Medina. And in the city of Najran, a Christian community had grown large enough to produce its own bishops and soon, its own martyrs. Arabia was not a blank page waiting for a prophet to fill it in. Judaism had a foothold in the north. Christianity had footholds in the south and on both imperial frontiers. What Mecca had, sitting in the middle of all of it, was rarer. A shrine older than any of these religions, run by a merchant elite that answered to none of the empires surrounding it. Islamic tradition credits a figure named Amr ibn Luhai with filling that shrine. The Kaaba, with idols brought back from Syria. One idol, tradition says, became hundreds. Mecca stood at the center of every competing world around it and belonged fully to none of them. That independence was about to get very expensive to challenge. Strip away the idols, and the Kaaba was already the most valuable real estate in Arabia, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with theology. Tradition held that the shrine and the well of Zamzam beside it had been built by Abraham and Ishmael. By the 6th century, it functioned as neutral ground. During 4 sacred months each year, raiding, feuding, and blood vengeance were suspended by shared custom, not by any ruler's law. Tribes that spent the rest of the year raiding each other's herds could walk into Mecca, circle the Kaaba, trade in its markets, and walk out unharmed. The nearby fair at Ukaz turned the same season into a cultural capital, where poets competed for reputation and tribes measured status against one another without drawing a blade. The Quraysh, the tribe that controlled the city, built an entire economy on top of that truce. Custodianship of the Kaaba gave them a protected status called the Hums, exempting them from restrictions other pilgrims observed, and marking them out as the sanctuary's permanent hosts, rather than just one tribe among many. Around that status, Quraysh merchants ran the ilaf, paired caravan routes timed to the sacred months, one south to Yemen in winter, one north to Syria in summer, so goods could move through hostile tribal territory under the same truce that protected pilgrims. Religion, protection, and trade were not 3 separate systems in Mecca. They were one system, and 360 idols sat at the center of it, guarding a business model that turned a town with no river and no farmland into the wealthiest city on Arabia's western edge. That is what Zayd walked away from. Not just a religion, his own family's income. If the Hanifs were reaching for a purer monotheism, they were not the first Arabs to try it that century. South Arabia had already run the experiment twice, within living memory, and it had already cost blood. Around 380 CE, the ruling elite of Himyar, in what is now Yemen, abandoned their old pantheon almost overnight for a single deity, invoked in inscription after inscription as Rahmanan, the merciful. Royal texts turned monotheistic within a generation. The old gods survived only at the margins, far from the capital. That monotheism leaned Jewish and held for roughly a century and a half, until Najran's Christian community, sitting inside Himyar's own borders, broke the peace. In 523 CE, Himyar's last Jewish king, remembered as Dunuas, laid siege to Najran and executed large numbers of its Christians. 2 years later, Christian Aksum invaded from across the Red Sea and ended his reign, installing Christian rule in his place. By the time Zayd and his companions were walking away from their own idols, South Arabia had already lived through state-enforced monotheism, a massacre carried out in God's name, and a foreign invasion that swapped one faith for another. Arabia already knew what one God, forced onto a kingdom, could do. Zayd was about to try something smaller and far riskier, doing it alone, with no king, no army, and no name yet for what he believed. If men really did reject Mecca's idols in the name of Abraham's God, there should be some trace of that idea outside Islamic memory. Archaeologists went looking, and what they found was not written by kings or priests. It was written by nobody in particular. The inscriptions had been sitting in the open for roughly 2,000 years. Carved by nomads, herding camel, sheep, and goat across the basalt deserts of Syria, Jordan, and northern Saudi Arabia. A British pilot spotted them from the air in the early 20th century. More than 35,000 are known today. Most of what survives is mundane by design. A name, a lineage, a prayer for rain or safety, but scattered among tens of thousands of these small, unusual religious references. Ordinary messages are invocations to a god, and the nomads called simply Allah, sometimes petitioned for mercy, sometimes for protection against death. The linguist Ahmad al-Jallad has spent years cataloging this corpus. Recent work, including a 2026 study on what researchers call the monotheistic zeitgeist of late antique Arabia, together with a newly excavated inscription site in northeastern Jordan, adds fresh evidence that a deity called Allah was already being invoked by name across pre-Islamic Arabia. Long before Muhammad, in some texts, as a light-giving creator god, called upon against death. For a moment, that looks like confirmation. The name predates Islam. The concept of a supreme creator god predates Islam. Here is the problem. Not one of these inscriptions names Zayd ibn Amr. Not one mentions Waraqa ibn Nawfal, or Mecca specifically, or anything resembling four friends making a pledge at a festival. The stones prove that monotheistic devotion to Allah existed somewhere in Arabia, across a wide region and a long stretch of time. They do not prove that this specific story about these specific men is what actually happened in 6th century Mecca. The evidence and the story never quite touch. One confirms a general idea. The other supplies the names and the drama, and those come from somewhere else entirely. Memory, written down 2 centuries later, by people who already knew how it ended. That memory comes mainly from Ibn Ishaq's biography of Muhammad, written roughly a century and a half after the events it describes, preserved chiefly through a later editor. It survived the way most early Islamic history did, as a named chain of transmitters, isnad. One generation reporting exactly what the last one told them. Islamic scholars built an entire discipline around testing those chains. whether a transmitter could actually have met the person he claimed to report from, whether his memory was considered reliable. It is not a contemporary written record, but it is not unchecked rumor either. It sits in between, memory with its own audit trail, applied generations later, by people who had every reason to want the answer to come out a certain way. That's the system behind every detail that follows. Tested, but never neutral. By most accounts, 4 men pulled away from a public idol festival in Mecca to say out loud what they'd all been thinking. The stones everyone worshipped could not see, could not hear, could not answer prayer. Not every early source agrees on the exact roster, a small inconsistency that is itself telling. A story remembered too perfectly is often one that's been smoothed over, that while ragged, disagreeing details more often point back to something real. They scattered in 4 directions and found 4 completely different answers. Starting with the one who never found a name for what he believed, and paid for it inside his own family. Zayd ibn Amr ibn Nawfal belonged to the Banu Adi, a clan of the Quraysh, the tribe that ran Mecca's economy. His own household lived off the very system he was about to reject. One family tie would matter later. His uncle, Al-Khattab ibn Nawfal, was the father of Umar ibn al-Khattab, Islam's future second caliph. Zayd concluded, the sources say, that a stone which could neither hear nor see nor help was not worth worship. He refused idol meat, rebuked his own tribe, and spoke out against the burial of infant daughters, a practice the Quran would later condemn directly. He traveled to Syria to question Jewish and Christian authorities and came away unsatisfied with both. He came home with no institution behind him and no name for what he believed, only a conviction. His own uncle, the man raising his household, turned against him for it. He stood alone in a city where survival meant belonging, cut off from his own family's gods, with nowhere left to search. Zayd died around 605 CE, roughly 5 years before Muhammad's first reported revelation. Still without a name for what he believed, and without ever knowing whether the God he'd spent a lifetime searching for would answer back. What makes his memory unusual is what came after it. A hadith preserved by Bukhari records Muhammad meeting Zayd once, before his own mission began, and later saying, Zayd would be raised alone as his own community on Judgment Day. A rare distinction for a man who died before Islam existed. His son became one of 10 companions promised paradise in Sunni tradition. And Umar, whose own father had persecuted Zayd, later married his daughter into that same family. The man his household rejected became the man his household could not stop honoring. Zayd's 3 companions took paths just as striking, even if later memory gave them less room. Waraqa ibn Nawfal a cousin of Khadija, Muhammad's future wife, studied Jewish and Christian scripture and settled on Christianity, respected across Mecca as a genuine scholar of the older faiths. Decades later, when Muhammad returned shaken from his first experience in the cave at Hira, it was the elderly Waraqa who reportedly told Khadija that what her husband had encountered matched the pattern of earlier prophetic revelation, comparing it to the calling of Moses. He died shortly afterward, but that single conversation gave the new revelation an early witness, who already understood from decades of study what a call to prophethood was supposed to look like. Uthman ibn al-Huwayrith also became a Christian and left for Byzantine territory, reportedly hoping for backing to return to Mecca as its ruler. He never did. The sources on him thin out considerably. Ubaydullah ibn Jahsh took the strangest turn of the four. He converted to Christianity, then reversed course, and accepted Islam during the earliest Muslim migration to Ethiopia, then, tradition says, abandoned Islam a second time and died outside the faith. His wife did not follow him. She stayed a Muslim and later married Muhammad himself. One name at the edge of the story almost got there first. The poet Umayya ibn Abi al-Salt spent years composing verse steeped in biblical language. God, judgment, the fate of nations, so much of it that some, who later heard the Quran, assumed Muhammad had been influenced by him rather than the reverse. By most accounts, Umayya expected the coming prophet to be himself. When revelation went instead to a merchant from Mecca, he refused to accept it out of envy and died outside the faith he'd spent a career anticipating. Scholars still argue how much of his poetry genuinely predates the Quran. Either way, he stands as the Hanif who came closest to claiming prophethood, and the one it cost the most. Qus ibn Sa'idah, a celebrated orator, is called a Christian bishop by some sources and a Hanif outright by others. Even later Islamic memory couldn't always agree where that line sat. The Quran names one more group that doesn't map onto any of this. Several verses list the Sabians alongside Jews, Christians, and believers, their fate before God treated on its own terms, without ever explaining who they actually were. No Hanif is ever called a Sabian in the tradition. But scholars still argue whether the label pointed to a baptizing sect related to the later Mandaeans of Iraq, or was simply outsiders' shorthand for the same kind of unaffiliated monotheists the Hanifs were said to be. The Quran mentions them and moves on. Nobody since has settled it. Every one of these men said they were looking for the same thing, not a new religion, but Abraham's. That wasn't arbitrary. Abraham was, by tradition, the man who built the Kaaba itself with his son Ishmael, the ancestor Arabs traced their own line back to. He belonged to Mecca, before Mecca belonged to any tribe living in it, and he belonged to no one's religion in particular. disciplined. Judaism and Christianity both claimed him,
but both organized formal communities around scripture that post-dated him by centuries.
He was a shared ancestor with no institutional heir. Older than every argument built around him, and the one figure a Meccan could reach for without converting to anything foreign. Not Christianity, tied to Byzantium, not Judaism, tied to Yathrib or Himyar.
Just Abraham, and whatever he had actually believed. That is what the word Hanif was reaching for. The word Hanif appears roughly a dozen times in the Quran, almost always describing Abraham, neither Jew nor Christian. Submitted to God before either religion existed in the form and the 6th century knew it. Inside the Islamic tradition, the meaning is settled, turning. Specifically turning away from idolatry toward one God. Outside it, the word's origin is one of the more contested small puzzles in early Islamic studies. Several Western linguists, most prominently François de Blois, argue Hanif was borrowed from an older Syriac word, hampa, used by Christian and Jewish communities to the north. In Syriac, Hanpa didn't mean a righteous monotheist. It meant close to the opposite, a pagan, an outsider to the faith. If that's right, an Arabic word later used to praise the purest kind of believer may have started life across the border as an insult, flipped completely somewhere on its way south, taken up not as a slur, but as a badge. That doesn't disprove that men like Zayd existed. But it means the very category Hanif may not be something 6th century Meccans invented for themselves. It may be a label reshaped after the fact. Once a community needed a word for the people who got there first. For everything tradition remember about what the Hanifs rejected, almost nothing survives about what they actually did. No Hanif prayer survives. No fixed ritual, no direction to face, no repeated practice. But it means the very category Hanif may not be something 6th century Meccans invented for themselves. Bowing to stone, but not clearly for anything he affirmatively performed beyond travel and search. That gap may be the most honest thing the tradition preserves. Men defined almost entirely by what they walked away from, with the shape of what they walked toward left blank. The Hanifs left no institutional trace, no organized movement, no shared text, no community that outlived its founders. What they left instead ran straight into the family lines that shaped early Islam. Waraqa became an early witness to the new faith at its very first moment. Zayd's connection ran deeper still. His nephew, through the very relative, who had persecuted him, became Umar, Islam's second caliph. His own son became one of the earliest, most trusted companions of Muhammad. Ubaydullah's abandoned widow became one of Muhammad's own wives. 4 men searched alone, with no movement and no shared text between them. Within a single generation, their families sat at the center of the one that followed. None of them lived to see what would come next. Zayd never learned any of this. He died still without a name for what he believed. Still an outsider in his own household, 5 years before the revelation that would prove him right.
The archaeology confirms that Allah was already a known name in Arabia, worshipped by some, long before Muhammad.
It does not confirm Zayd, or a pledge made at a festival.
Those details come only from memory, tested and transmitted by a chain of named reporters, who had every reason to want their prophet's arrival to look like fulfillment rather than rupture. Even the word Hanif itself may carry a hidden history, arriving in Arabic already carrying someone else's insult. So did the Hanifs preserve a fragment of Abraham's original faith, quietly, for generations, until Islam arrived to complete it? Or did later generations look back at a handful of ordinary religious dissenters and an old borrowed word, and remember them through the lens of the faith that came after? The stones cannot answer that. They only tell us the world Zayd was said to inhabit was real. Whether the man himself belongs to history, memory, or somewhere between the two, is a question every generation has to answer for itself.